We can talk more about the DA's manifesto launch now with researcher and political analyst Angelo Fick joining us from Johannesburg. Angelo, good to have you as ever on Newsfeed PM. So John Steenhuisen was saying today the central message is that the DA gets things done and that they are the only party in the country that can say that. Is he right?
Well, that's a test that I think the party is proposing voters should judge it on. And if we look at the 37-page manifesto that they've released, they've certainly chosen which of the municipalities where they govern they want to foreground and which issues in those municipalities they want to foreground. In the spectacular performances that we've seen this morning, we certainly had individual mayors and mayoral candidates and people in the party from those various places speak to their successes. But the question is whether or not the DA's rhetoric and the oratory matches the experience of people on the ground across the divisions of those towns and cities. And there I think the election on the 1st of November will demonstrate, particularly in those spaces, what people's experiences are and their evaluation of it, and in other spaces where the DA wishes to make an inroad, how the rest of the population views the party and its performance.
And one such area would be the city of Cape Town, isn't it, where people say the DA runs a fantastic administration at municipal level in the suburbs, but when you go to places like Khayelitsha, people say the experience is quite different.
So anywhere that a party governs in a society as divided as South Africa, you're likely to see those kinds of inequities and inequalities of delivery. And the Democratic Alliance has repeatedly demonstrated or repeatedly claimed that some of those failures are the consequence of national government policy. But in a city like Cape Town, researchers have indicated that what you have here is a neoliberal paradigm. It's an attempt to govern the many on behalf of the few. So if we look at the housing issue that the DA's mayoral candidate tried to raise, the rhetoric is what we should have is a release of public lands that are currently in use for parliamentarians or military land for the development of public housing. But this is the same city that has very much favored property developers in the inner circle of the central business district and the immediate ring around that in places like Sea Point, Greenpoint, to have international developers and international tourism-oriented development happen. And so what we're looking at here is whether or not this is a city government that can reverse the spatial dynamics of colonialism and apartheid and stick to its, vision in this election manifesto because, to give it its due, the Democratic Alliance's election manifesto is a forward-looking document. Mm-hmm. It is not just a document that relies on past and past kind of either failures or successes. It also sketches a vision for what it wants to achieve in the next 5 years. And there, I think, its past record will speak very much to how people judge it on its future aspiration.
So, like with any other election, the issues are the same. The manifestos are not radically different. You have been tracking elections in this country for years, and often we're left trying to make sense of how much emphasis voters put, for example, on their loyalty to a particular political party, political brand, versus actual service delivery objectives and issue-based voting.
So it's very easy if one does not live in a community to simply see what isn't delivered, to hear when people speak about what isn't delivered as that being the dominant experience. But in these communities, and this goes for both the African National Congress and the DA, and in those municipalities where other parties like the IFP have governed before, there is a very mixed record, and people tend to also value what has been done for them and vote on the record of that. So it's not just party loyalty. I think there is a certain amount of rationality in voters, and part of that rationality has to do also with people's perceptions of trust in political parties, in the people that they deploy. And much of the Democratic Alliance's campaigning over the years has been about being able to trust individuals that they deploy as candidates in these wards and municipalities. What many people object to and often critique the party for is the way in which that often gets run roughshod over. And this has been a particular challenge for the party in the wake of its shift from Mmusi Maimane into this new incarnation that it wishes to have. And in this particular manifesto launch, we certainly heard from people like Gwen Ngwenya, whose handwriting is very visible across this particular manifesto. And that's not a bad thing. That means that there is now greater policy centrality inside the Democratic Alliance, and people's judgment of the party will reflect on those people's choices on what it is they want to foreground. And this is crucial, that I think it shouldn't become political, footballing, where parties just give voters everything that they want them to hear and that voters say they want to hear. But the parties actually have to have a realistic vision, and that they have to have realizable plans. Whether or not the Democratic Alliance has that consistently is a different story, because there are pockets in its manifesto where it is terribly honest about its own sort of, shall we say, successes and the failures that it compares itself to in terms of the ANC in government. But there are pockets where it's very selective in its reading of things, including, when it says it has zero tolerance for corruption. The people of Cape Town may have a different view of that, given the party standing by a councillor who was accused of diverting funds irregularly. When it comes to open opportunity, many South Africans might want to look at those municipalities and ask tough questions, and suggest that things are not always what they seem. But this is the nature of politics. The DA is not exceptional in this.
And John Steenhuisen did say in his speech there that the DA's election manifesto is anchored in reality. But I want to touch on something that you raised, the change in the DA's strategy and positioning based on the drama that we saw unfold after the national government elections in 2019 that led to somewhat of an exodus led by Mmusi Maimane. Do you think the party has recovered enough from the departure of Maimane, Patricia de Lille and Herman Mashaba?
So in some respects, the party has moved on. So in those lists of candidates that it has deployed across the length and breadth of South Africa, to use that cliche that political parties like, it's clear that it has internally, pulled together and decided which candidates to field. But in some senses, it remains in ghostly battles with previous leaders in the party, and the spectre of Mmusi Maimane is only one of them. The choice of foregrounding land use and battling Patricia de Lille speaks to another issue. And then at the local level in the city of Cape Town, with officials who have left the Democratic Alliance and become members of the Good movement, there continue to be battles with Brett Heron and company. So these kinds of issues are not just ordinary electioneering. It really is an attempt to exorcise the party of so much of what many people saw as its positive elements for well on a decade, and re-articulate the party in terms of the new vision of people like John Steenhuisen, Gwen Ngwenya and others. And whether or not that succeeds in the polls is not just going to be, do they repeat the mixed fortunes of the by-elections over the last 2 years, or do they repeat what we saw in the national elections in 2019 and have a lower percentage in some very specific spaces? I think for the party to really move on, the strategy that they've chosen, which is local issues at local level, is a strategy that paid off for the NFP years ago, and that many parties who want to make inroads into the ANC's dominance may wish to pursue, and that the DA, once it gets into those positions, will have to implement very quickly.
And final question, the coalition agreements in Tshwane and Johannesburg were symbolic, to say the least. What does the Democratic Alliance have to do in this round of elections to ensure that it either gets a straight-out majority, or if it doesn't, it is able to still continue cordial relations with the other parties to allow it back to run council?
The 5 weeks ahead of an election is a really tough call on parties to suggest that there are things that they now need to do in the next 5 weeks to sway voters. Many voters have already decided and are now listening for details for the undecided and the swaying. In terms of maintaining good relations with other parties, the Democratic Alliance tried to do that in 2016, and it didn't really work because the horse trading happened along, lines that the Democratic Alliance claimed violated its core principles. And there is some subtweeting, as young people call it, of previous figures. So the DA candidate for Johannesburg mayoral position really subtweeted another candidate by suggesting she's in it for the long haul and she'll stick for 5 years. She's not going to leave early. That kind of election posturing is good to hear, that they are not unwilling to be combative. But the question is whether or not voters trust them enough. And, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't look into the minds and choices of 25 to 30 million people. But the test will come on the 1st of November. The strength of the Democratic Alliance is its ability and willingness to have forward-looking politics rather than just backward-looking, we will repeat what we've done before. There is some of that, but that's not the majority of the division. The second issue is whether or not so much of the rhetoric that is in the delivery of these speeches is backed up by the substance of people's experiences. And certainly there one can contrast its claims for Drakenstein that it provided shelter for people during the COVID crisis with the people's experience of Strandfontein and the removal of homeless people from the city. And this kind of contrast happens at every level in that manifesto, as it would happen for any political party. And here, whether substance wins over rhetoric or rhetoric over substance is going to be the test for the deal.
Angelo Fick, always great to speak to you. Thank you.